By 2050, it's estimated that the number of people living in Western countries will make up only about 12% of the world's population. In his new book, Westlessness, Samir Puri argues that that's going to have profound implications for the West, economically, diplomatically, and culturally. On the show today, Samir and I talk about his new book. We also discuss the weakening nostalgia for the Washington-led world order of the 1990s, why Samir believes that Trump's transactional foreign policy is more honest than Joe Biden's American exceptionalism. We also talk about his time as a diplomat, and how David Lammy and the Labour government are navigating this increasingly Westless world. I hope you enjoy. Samir, thank you very much for sparing the time to be a guest.
Delighted to be with you.
I'm going to start with my Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. What is your favourite word?
My favourite word is my invented word, Westlessness, clearly, which is the title of the book.
Always be selling.
Always be selling, but also, it's a contraction of a couple of words, but that's my favourite word. My favourite W, if we're going down the Sesame Street route.
What is your least favourite word?
Probably Trump. Not because I have this personal antipathy towards him, but because of the monopolisation of our mental bandwidth by one thing, which I think sometimes is actually a bit overdone.
In the days after the election, it sort of occurred to me how for the last 4 years, it had been quite nice not to really think about him and not have him dominate so much of my thoughts.
Yeah, and this is something that's so interesting, is that if you're an American citizen, it very directly affects you because it is your country, it's how it's being governed. If you're not, if you're outside of America, if you're on the other side of the world, it still infiltrates your news discussions, people's topics of conversation. But I do think the impact is considerably less. And I think that's one of the themes I'm particularly interested in is whether there's a tendency outside of the US to actually overplay the impacts of this. Because obviously tariffs and threats and all the rest of it are disruptive, but there are many other forces that make the world go round as well.
What is your favourite swear word?
I think probably the four-letter one that begins with an S. Simple.
Did any of your research for Westlessness prompt you to use it?
No, I don't think so. I think I wanted to approach what is potentially quite a concerning topic, especially for some Westerners, but with a spirit of optimism. Not because I'm trying to be blindly naive, but the world is always a changing place. You just wanted to capture that sense of change. To the extent that things actually are concerning, that I think is really about your own personal view of the world, what you're attached to, the certain assumptions that you have. I tend to have quite a flexible mind with regards to some of the assumptions around which the world are governed. And change to me is not necessarily a scary thing.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
Probably a coffee machine kicking into gear. Obviously, then followed by a very nice smell. And weirdly, a seatbelt clinking together. It's a very nice and encompassing clink. As the seatbelt on an aeroplane makes.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Obviously, fingernails down a chalkboard, and anything that could conceivably be described as fingernails down a chalkboard using that metaphor, because I think it's even the metaphor is pretty unsettling.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
None that I'd admit.
What is your favourite book?
My favourite book, in terms of what I've probably read recently, Clive Myri's autobiography is the BBC journalist. So I thought a very well composed book. I was given a copy about sort of 8 months ago, and I sort of got around to reading it. And I really loved him telling his story as a black British guy coming into Bolton, I think it was, probably the 60s, in terms of his sort of his start of his life, and just how much the UK has changed through his sort of BBC career. Now, he's extremely well-established part of BBC architecture, but just that journey of how Britain has changed, how the world has changed, and some of his depictions of his foreign correspondent reporting in Singapore, where I've lived, also in parts of Africa, which made him feel a very particular way as a black Brit going to sub-Saharan African country. I thought the articulation was really interesting. And one sort of other history book, Paris 1919, about the Versailles settlement. It's about 20 years old. British-Canadian academic called Margaret Macmillan. I thought was, as someone who's interested in world order and changing world order, 1919, over a century ago, that's a very clear inflection point where the world was literally reordered. A really, I thought, articulate and thorough accounting of the global ramifications of what happened at the end of the world.
I also love Paris 1919, and I was going back through it recently, and it occurred to me that the weird similarities between Trump and Woodrow Wilson, which many people might not think, but I was sort of thinking problematic views towards race and preference for younger wives. Aside from those two, a belief in sort of only he can bring peace to Europe, sort of whether European leaders want it or not, and then also a very hyper-partisan view of politics, probably to the detriment of his own policy agenda. So when I was going through the book, it was like, well, they're weirdly similar.
Yeah, and I think Wilson ends up being known for the 14 points around peace, but there's a lot more to it. He was a man of his time, and the Versailles settlement was absolutely a reflection of then established colonial mindsets that, whether the American government said they didn't actually share or not, that was just one of the ways in which the world was ordered. And as we know, the British and the French empires reached their apex in terms of territorial size off of that settlement.
Finally, is there a fictional character who you like to imagine yourself to be?
No, I don't think so. Not since my adolescence.
So I've been into foreign policy since I was like a weird kid, but not many people are. So I thought I'd start by asking, how did you get into geopolitics and world affairs?
Probably a very typical route for a British boy in particular is that sort of World War II fascination that is kind of part of the popular culture zeitgeist. So, under the age of 10. Actually, I really remember the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, 1990, just how it's commemorated. I was very young. At the age where you're buying like die-cast Spitfires and Hurricanes. But that's clearly a very strong connection to like, the big shaping event of the 20th century from a very immature perspective. The second side of it was the fact my family are the outcome of Commonwealth migration, being of Indian heritage, being brought up, being born actually in Kenya. Those are my mother and father, Kenya and Tanzania, me being born in the UK. So international affairs is obviously part of the fabric of your own family existence. The views that are refracted back into the household are views from India, from East Africa, very naturally, because family lineage come from there. And that just internationalises your perspective. So I'd say probably one part traditional sort of British and probably quite English influences around interpretations of history, and the other part very much the international aspects of my family heritage.
When did you realise it could be a career?
I think I've always only really worked on international affairs. I did a history and politics degree, so that's from the age of 17 you're making those choices. And then I did a war studies master's program when I was 21. And I think to me it was, at the time, I was very bullish about it. There's no compromise that my work will entail these subjects. And at the time I remember thinking, if I can't get a job, then I'm just going to go straight to do a PhD. But I'm not going to compromise. I'm not going to go get a generic management consulting job. I'm not going to do a law conversion course. And then lo and behold, that has actually worked out. I've worked at many different places, but I've always tended to work on geopolitics, defence, security, whether from a practical perspective, from the perspective of working in a think tank, whether it's from a perspective of being an author. There's all sorts of ways you can approach it. And actually, I think the diversity of professions I've had around the core topics has been very healthy, because it means you're viewing the same topics, the same event, from different professional perspectives.
So you worked in the Foreign Office after sort of doing your PhD and working at RAND. And so I'm curious about, did you see any differences between the theory of geopolitics and diplomacy and the actual practice of it?
Yeah, I mean, they're totally distinct. Obviously, the theory of it is an intellectual exercise in which people try to find patterns in the way in which governments, countries, international actors behave. They have theories around the dominant forces guiding, often quite impersonal forces, in political science anyway, guiding the actions of states. Historians, on the other hand, they very much personalise their study of what's happening. They look at the specifics of particular historical episodes. But the practice of diplomacy, the practice of government, is much more focused on events and relationships, because it is a very tangible thing. And either a government is attempting to preemptively influence what's going to happen, or it's responding to a situation that it is somehow embroiled in, either by choice or not by choice. And then there's a steady management of relations with countries around the world. And increasingly, of course, there's just lots of non-state interests and actors, whether it's media actors, civil society actors, NGOs, that each have their own sort of foreign policies or their influence on foreign policies. But it's also, even in like a 15-year career, things have fundamentally shifted because of modern technology, because of the way in which information flows. But I'd say to sum all of that up, there's a very big difference between the study of international relations and the practice of foreign policy. To the point that you don't have to have studied international relations to practice foreign policy. You could actually just be very skilled in the actual demands of what that actually entails. You also don't actually have to have done foreign policy to be an intellectual who studies it from the international relations perspective. Although there's a wide variety of things that are produced that are slightly useless versus things that from the intellectual space versus things that actually do, I think, characterise what's happening.
I mean, several months ago, I interviewed Damien Collins about his book about David Lloyd George and the coalition government and negotiating Versailles. And something that sort of fascinated me about Paris 1919 as well is Lloyd George's political experience being foundational to his diplomatic skill, and not really having that sort of background, say, foreign policy knowledge, but having these skills as a negotiator that he drawed on from sort of climbing the greasy pole.
Yeah, and also the skills of being a coalition builder. Building domestic coalitions is very different to doing that internationally, but clearly you can translate the skills.
So you were working in the Foreign Office when I was doing my master's, and my sort of focus of my dissertation was about sort of David Cameron's foreign policy.
Yeah.
And I think it's been overshadowed by the referendum and Brexit, but I always thought at the time that Cameron's worldview had a sort of subconscious knowledge of Westlessness.
Yeah.
I can remember sort of big chunks of his party conference speeches being devoted to sort of quote-unquote global Britain and its national interest among like rising geopolitical competition. And there seemed to be a lot of effort put into sort of courting China, India, Turkey. And so I'm sort of curious if you found that working on it day to day at the time.
China and India was very much part of what was then the UK's prosperity agenda, as in they were perceived as being centres of potential investment, of trade and partnership. And there was no securitized perception of China to the extent that there is now. That's totally different. And I don't think that's anything to do with David Cameron necessarily. I think that's just also a reflection of the geopolitics. I also say the Cameron era, even though the Cameron era is up to 2016 clearly, 2010 to 2016, still in foreign affairs very heavily influenced by post 9/11 geopolitical concerns that aren't really concerns in that way now. Iraq was still a going concern when Cameron came in the coalition government. The UK withdrew its forces, I think, around 2010. Afghanistan clearly was a huge focus. Libya and the Arab Spring also happened. So I would say that the Middle East and counter-terrorism issues were probably very, very big points of focus. I would say the reason I wrote the book, nothing to do with David Cameron, but I think it's more just a passage of time, using him as a marker in time from then to now. The palpable sense of there being a transition period in global affairs or of the impact of rising powers on the way in which global affairs functions, is much more realised today, even though we're talking about trends that have brewed for, China entered the WTO 20 years ago. India has always had great prospects of becoming a major player in the world economy. But I think it's the realisation of that on day-to-day events and the feel that it actually affects things in a very tangible way. That, I think, is quite a new feeling. And also the confidence levels in some of the non-Western rising countries, or the sense of self-realised autonomy that you can either have a casting vote in a global debate on a global issue. I say a vote, not in a literal sense, but in the sense of volunteering your opinions, or whether your material heft is now something that's so substantial that there are many countries who are coming to your doorstep asking for your support on things, for the trade. And the final point on this, with Trump in mind, is the ability of countries around the world to feel as if they can weather the storm. That, just because you may fall into the bad books of the new US president, that is not the be-all and end-all of your international prospects, because it's a more multipolar era. And I wouldn't say that the Cameron era, just to date it in that 6-year period, felt very multipolar. It still felt very much like this. The US was the locus around which a lot of global debates are happening. Everybody else just had to sort of sit around and watch and wait as to what would happen from Washington.
I mean, that was something that always frustrates me studying it. There would be these speeches sort of outlining this grandiloquent global Britain vision, but actually a lot of the bandwidth was, say, something like Libya, which didn't necessarily align with that sort of there's like that Fitzgerald line about an artist is someone who can have two competing ideas and still function. And it always felt like foreign policy then was sort of, on the one hand, a sort of realist global Britain vision, and on the other, a sort of Blair-esque 90s humanitarian intervention kind of thing. And the two sort of were held simultaneously, and it wasn't entirely clear where the bandwidth was going.
I think that's a reasonable observation, because the other thing that those of us of the right age will remember that David Cameron gained traction as a Tory leadership hopeful because of the parallels to Blair, as in a younger politician, and this is as superficial as it was, with like a head of hair, telegenic in that sense, with an appealing family life to present to the cameras, very much like a 90s, early 2000s way of presenting a politician. That we've actually, there's a vestige of that today, but it's just not as keenly felt, I think. But I think that's a fair point. But for the UK, there was no way to dictate this war on terror. Like the Americans would have waged it anyway. So you're caught up somewhat in the maelstrom. And decisions, it's not really to go back now and talk about whether those are the right or the wrong decisions. Clearly, some of them were very ill-judged. But you can't really market a sort of a modernising Britain if actually what a lot of your foreign policy entails is a nation-building mission in Afghanistan that is actually headed to a disastrous end, an intervention in Libya that also doesn't have decisive end to it, and arguably has left the country in a more difficult state. And that's not a UK issue. That's also UK, France, US. Those are the intervening powers.
We've kind of touched on it, but I wondered if you could give an overview of your book, Westlessness.
Yeah, with pleasure. So it's called Westlessness, The Great Global Rebalancing, and it is like a multi-thematic view as to where the West is likely to be in terms of influence and position in relation to the rest of the world in the next few decades. It's not anti-Western. It's not saying that the West has done something wrong or everyone hates the West. It's just this sense that we're in a transition period in world affairs where there are actual alternatives to the IMF, to the EU, to the US as your trade partners. If you fall foul of the Western countries, Russia clearly has done, you can actually now turn to Asian countries to continue trading. And it's not no substitute, but it is a sizable replacement. So it's a very live example I give at the start of the book. No matter what one might have said about sanctioning Russia from a G7, therefore West plus Japan perspective, that heft to actually then bring another major economy to its knees to punish it for its illegal invasion of Ukraine isn't there anymore. Like the G7 used to, when I was an undergraduate 20 years ago, represent about 65% of the global economy. It represents closer to half of the global economy. And that's because of the changing economic balance of power in the world, in which China, India, clearly, but also in the near future, potentially Indonesia and others, will just emerge faster and faster as emerging economies. And I sort of put to the reader of the book, well, at one point they will need a different name. They won't be emerging economies. Other things I look at in the book is just the basic empirical facts around the percentage of humanity that is Western, as in how many of us, as a percentage of the global population, are Westerners. And I was amazed to find out, really was quite an astonishing moment, the stats that the UN produce. More or less, say, in 1950, about 28% of humanity was in a Western country. And by 2050, that would be about 12%. And that's because of differing levels of birth rates, aging population. All that it's about, the book's not about why that's happening. That you can read about that in a demography book. It's the outcome of that. If most of humanity isn't Western to a greater extent than ever before, by say 2045, 2050, how will that shape things like the popular culture that is the most profitable, the stories that are told in the world? How many people are telling stories that have the greatest traction for most people around the world? And then to bring all that into focus, sort of the selling point of the book is you can produce a sort of a comparison of who's got the biggest economy today, who do we think will have the biggest economies in the future, whereas military spending, it's all kind of hard power. I also wanted to look at, in international affairs, the actual impact of the power of westernisation of people all over the world through adopting English, having a favourite Premier League football club, loving American films, even if they don't like George W. Bush or Donald Trump in different eras. That power of the appeal of westernisation, it's soft power, but it's also the functionality of westernising your identities if you're on the other side of the world, to some extent, to participate in a global economy that is very centred around the West. It's looking at the mortality of that set of arrangements just through the passage of time, the increasing self-assertion, increasing confidence of non-Western cultures, the ability of non-Western countries to actually forge very productive partnerships with each other, for example, through the BRICS partnerships. Not that I think BRICS is a rival to NATO, and people often in the West say, well, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is now expanded to others, they don't have an institutionalised, centralised way of making decisions, so it's not a challenge to the West. But my point to there is that's not the right way to look at it. I think what it is serving is as a way of normalising the ability of very powerful non-Western countries, some of which have got quite strong growth prospects, to band together in small groups within that banner to do things among themselves that don't actually involve going through the West, whether literally through the West as in using Western currencies to denominate their trade, or seeking Western approval for things, or even doing things with Western objection being the reaction that's been provoked on the other side of the world, but just doing it in ways that reflect their own priorities. And that, I don't think, is a world, to wrap all that up in terms of, sort of what the book covers, that I don't think is a world that any of us have ever lived in. Because we've lived through this huge era of US-led globalization that we're still kind of in. And before that, we lived through an era of European-led maritime trading, colonization. And of course, we know both world wars sprang out largely of disputes within Europe, and the First World War in particular, but also the Second, magnified globally because of European empires that brought in much of the rest of the world. So we're moving quite far away from that world. And whether you personally think the term sort of Western centrism is sort of an insult or just I just think it's a reality. I think the world has been quite Western centric for a variety of quite structural reasons, and I think that's broken down quite quickly. And I wanted to look into how quickly it's broken down and speculate in an educated way what some of the implications of that diffusion of influence and power might be.
I mean, among the various points you made, it was the demographic one that really got me. The sort of concentration and expansion of population in Asia, and then what that will mean in terms of economic power, economic consumption, popular culture consumption. That was the one, especially that stat that you've alluded to. I think was it 3 in 10 to 1 in 10?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, it's about sort of 28, 29% down to about 12%. But yeah, roughly just a bit less than a third of the world being people in Western countries, to coming to closer to 1 in 10. That's quite a change. Obviously, the global population has expanded in that time. So the implication is not that there aren't many Westerners. There's actually, obviously, Western countries are more populous than they were in the past. But as a percentage, I think it is meaningful that a hefty percentage of the world is greater than ever before. The other point is a lot of the Western world's influence was Western European outward migration. I mean, that's why the ancestral link to Australia, North America is there. That demographic explosion in Europe in the 19th century is also why a lot of people in South America have got European heritages. Whether they would now consider themselves to be Western in terms of outlooks and geopolitics, that's a much more debatable point. But you can see how that demographic outward expansion from what was largely Western Europe contained, which was the old definition of the West, has shaped the world over a couple of centuries. But that's now a bygone era. Those demographic realities don't exist anymore.
So I really enjoyed the book, but I also found it challenging. So on the one hand, I'm really interested in 19th and 20th century great power diplomacy. So the idea of a more geopolitically balanced international order is sort of conceivable to me. And the idea of all the wheeling and dealing that will entail is quite exciting. But as you touch on repeatedly in the book, I grew up in the 90s. I loved the West Wing. So I have an instinctual, nostalgic idea of a sort of American-led, Western-dominated order that is the best of all possible worlds. But then on the third hand, the last 10 years have really knocked my confidence in that. So it was a very intellectually challenging book.
So that chronology is exactly what I wanted to capture, is that sense in which not only the West, but the US in particular, was a focal point of a lot of aspiration. It was actually a focal point, generationally, probably both you and I, in that sort of early 2000s moment of modernity. Like, if you're British, you tended to understand America as a kind of a bigger, better version of where you lived. And actually, a lot of people were very Atlanticist. A lot of Brits wanted to move to America. That's true for people like all over the world. America was this kind of beacon place. That does feel much more questioned now for a whole variety of reasons we don't need to go into. It doesn't really matter why you find that to be a less of a dominant reality. I think the movement away from it being a dominant reality to being a much more questioned reality is part of this passage away from one era of world affairs to another. Those of us who are interested in history, we always read about different eras of history, one bleeding into the other, right? We read about the long 19th century, the Napoleonic War, the post-Napoleonic period. We read about the collapse of the Chinese Empire. What we're living through at the moment is not like a war-induced, empire collapsing-induced transition. We're living through quite a steady, gradual transition. There's a lot of events that capture the attention: Ukraine, Gaza, Trump. But the reality of it is that the world is slightly de-westernizing. It's multi-polarizing. Not at an aggressive breakneck speed, but it's happening. And so that's why there is a sense, I think, of previously held assumptions feeling like they're a little less solid than they were. And sometimes what we see, whether it's Trump, Ukraine, it's kind of the outward manifestations of changing world.
And you make a point in the book that it's sort of unclear the extent to which trends will either accelerate or sort of continue to go slowly. And something you allude to is sort of a potential return of Trump. How do you feel the last 2 weeks what effect they've had on those trends?
Right, so I wrote the book. Obviously, it's been finalised in 2024. Kamala Harris wasn't even a presidential candidate as I finished up in the summer. I wrote the book on the assumption Trump would win, not because I wanted him to win, but my honest view of it was I thought Biden, the Democrats, are putting something that was quite weak out there. I felt with the global perspective in mind, again, I don't follow US domestic issues and culture wars, so that's not my angle on this. Felt that Biden was running, I felt, quite a 90s foreign policy, which is, a lot of it was based around assumptions around US primacy that I don't think are shared by many others around the world. So there's a lot of, obviously the Americans are still the single most powerful country in the world, but they don't corral global leadership in the way that I think was a bit more automatically understood in the 90s. And then, again, understood after 9/11, albeit resisted, but still understood that this was, the dominant force in world affairs. And I think the demonization of China because of US-China great power competition, because I've been living in Asia for the last 5 years, I didn't think was a very accurate depiction of how much of the rest of the world perceives China's rise, which I felt was off. Weirdly, I felt Donald Trump's populist interpretation of America's position in the world is, for very weird reasons, actually a bit more honest, which is the US has to be more transactional. The US can't really rely on a moral leadership argument. The US, even if it tried to corral this kind of alliance of countries, it wouldn't necessarily function the way that it did in the 90s or the early 2000s. I actually think those are actually quite accurate descriptions of the US's position. So there's a kind of a go it alone, bolster our position, make everybody pay for the support that we're already been giving them, all the rest of it. And I think, the whole accusation of US hypocrisy was because previous US presidents presented a moral standard against which to judge the American, performance in foreign affairs. Trump doesn't have a moral standard. He just has like a basic material reality standards presenting out there. And I think it's not that people around the world will welcome the lack of hypocrisy. I think there's an appreciation. It's just a very honest way of depicting America's current task, as Trump has set it, to maintain its number one position at a time when that is actually challenged. And that sense of challenge is, again, not one that we've ever really experienced. I don't even think people in the early Cold War, as probably as far back as then when the USSR maybe actually was presenting a very credible challenge to US-led global order, in the 50s and 60s. But the later Cold War, I don't think that sense of credible challenge was particularly there because the Soviet economy was pretty weak. So it's now a very long time since the US has really, I think, faced a very strong peer competitor. Last point on this, I don't also think it's just about China. I think it is about the mobilization of non-Western solidarity among different points of the non-Western world to actually be a bit less penetrated and find the way the US does things to be the less decisive thing than ever before.
David Lammy gave a big speech on Labour's foreign policy the other week, and he sort of made the point that kind of without using the phrase, but acknowledging that Westlessness was happening, and that Britain needs to engage, sort of the phrase he used, global south. How do you feel Britain ought to navigate a Westlessness era?
Yeah, so that's a critical point. And one thing I really appreciate about David Lammy is he just instinctively gets that. And it's not from a political correctness, diversity in the globe for the sake of it. It is actually from support for international positions for the UK, whether it's on Ukraine or Gaza. There's a lot more of a potential for a different opinion. And there's less of a sense of deference to a British position or a Western position than there was. It's also down to post-Brexit trade arrangements. So that's just a pure self-interest perspective. I've seen this in Asia where the UK government actually made some really good advances with Singapore, where it's based on its bite. Nothing to do with me. I'm just observing this because I'm living there, around UK, Singapore digital trade. UK joining the CPTPP, the Asia-focused, Japan-centered somewhat trading arrangement. So that's the global south is a big tent. It's a bit of a meaningless term. Engaging India is very different to engaging Kenya, very different to engaging Indonesia. And I think having a view as a British foreign secretary or anyone working British foreign policy as to where natural advantages do arise for the UK because of its colonial past. It may have people like me, people like David Lammy, who've got heritages from way outside of the European heritage world, way outside of the West. That can be an asset, just on a kind of a soft power level, but also from a sense of trying to understand other people's perspectives rather than foisting your own perspectives on them to improve your negotiating position. Secondly, there's obviously a lot of links in terms of expats, British institutions, appeal of higher education, diffusion of the world service, that still actually plays very positively across Commonwealth countries and is a material reality of how media is consumed, where people would send their children to be educated. That's also an asset. The flip side of that, of course, is that with a greater self-assertion in several parts of what we call the global south, around interpreting their own national histories in ways that suit people's sensibilities and emotions in those countries, that the UK can look historically like the bad guy. And I don't think it's a case of self-flagellation because of colonial guilt. I also don't think it's like just asserting yourself because the empire was great. I think it's appreciating there's quite a range of opinions about this. I can say from my own sort of extended family, there can be love-hate relationships with British colonial histories, which are still in living memory in parts of Asia, parts of Africa. As in, of course, that's what helped to bring our country into the modern world. It is also a lingering sense of subjugation over past conquest, and obviously the racism that was very much part of the way in which the British Empire mobilised its sort of elite view of the world. That's a historical era, that's a bygone era. It's an ongoing task to modernise Britain's historic connections all over the world, for the sake of Britain's own national interest, for it remaining a globally significant country.
I mean, I imagine it's a sort of legacy of empire, but I think something that connects both Remainers and sort of quote-unquote liberal leavers and conservatives and Labour is this sort of idea that Britain is an African country, or should be in Africa, or is an Asian country, or should be in Asia, and not just Britain is a European country. That seemed to be whether it was, that Spectator cover during the referendum about Britain out into the world, or David Lammy's speech, that seems to be a sort of intellectual something all these sides can cohere around. That Britain isn't somehow European; it should be out there in the world.
Yeah, I mean, the Brexiteers mobilised an argument around Britain being a maritime trading nation historically. One could also interpret that as saying an imperial power historically. But definitely, Britain is a very connected country. For a rainy island in the middle of, sort of the edge of Europe, effectively. It has a very diverse composition of people, not all of whom came as immigrants, many of whom came as Commonwealth subjects. Even if the Commonwealth isn't like a materially significant foreign policy tool, it does exist. It does tie the UK to all kind of parts of the world. The UK has also got a lot to offer other parts of the world because the English language is so widely spoken. Because a lot of what Britain offers is actually quite appealing, has little niches, whether it's everything from British senses of humour to British universities. There's a lot of positivity around aspects of what Britain offers. And that's a really good thing because it's part of the sinews of the ways in which many people think about the world as they think about things that came from Britain, think about things and technologies that were exported out of the UK. Maybe the terms of that export were a bit weighted and a bit unfair and potentially quite awful because it was within the context of colonial empire. But that doesn't mean to say something good can't come out something controversial in the past.
Samir, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
I want to thank Samir again for sparing the time to talk to me. If you would like to buy Westlessness and support independent stores in the UK, you can check the Strategy Aaron bookshop page. The link is in the show notes. There are also links to mine and Samir's socials. I have so many more great guests coming up for you, so I hope you tune in again next time.